What if the only thing separating you from the life you privately believe you deserve has nothing to do with talent, intelligence, or luck? Daniel Walter, a Canadian author who studied cognitive neuroscience at Yale University before becoming a best-selling writer, makes a claim in his book The Power of Discipline that quietly unsettles anyone who has ever set a goal and watched it quietly die. He argues that your brain is biologically wired to protect comfort over growth, and almost nobody is ever taught how to fight back against that wiring. This book matters right now because we live inside the most distracting environment human beings have ever had to discipline themselves within. Walter's work has sold over 350,000 copies worldwide, and inside it sits a specific psychological trap that convinces capable people they are simply lazy when something far more structural is actually at play. There is also a particular 10-minute experiment, mentioned later in this book, that quietly exposes how little self-control most people actually have, and what happens once you finally see it cannot be unseen. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why willpower alone has never worked for you, and you will walk away with a specific system Walter uses to rebuild discipline from the inside out. 2 questions will follow you through this entire masterclass and only fully resolve in the final section, so stay with us. Before we go further, if strategic, unfair advantages in life, money, and mindset interest you, subscribe to the Book Vault and tap that like button because we release this kind of breakdown every single week. The Strategic Breakdown, every single week. The Strategic Breakdown, the biological truth about discipline. Now we step into the foundation of everything Walter built this book on, the chapter he frames around what he calls the biological truth about discipline. Most people assume discipline is a personality trait some are simply born with. Walter dismantles that belief immediately. He explains that self-control is a skill rooted in actual brain function, not destiny, and that specific regions inside your prefrontal cortex are responsible for weighing long-term reward against short-term temptation every single time you make a decision. Inside the vault, we call this the invisible negotiation, because that is exactly what is happening inside your skull dozens of times a day without you ever noticing. Neuroscientists Todd Hare and Colin Kammerer ran a now well-known 2009 brain imaging study observing participants as they chose between immediate and delayed rewards. People who consistently picked the long-term option showed heightened activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex alongside the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the exact region tied to self-control under pressure. But this is where most people quietly give up before they even start. They hear the word biological and assume it means fixed, permanent, unchangeable, a life sentence handed down by genetics. That assumption is dangerous, and it is also completely false. Walter's entire argument rests on the opposite truth, that because discipline lives in trainable neural pathways rather than fixed personality, it can be strengthened with the same deliberate repetition you would use to build a muscle. Most people listening right now believe their lack of discipline says something permanent about their character. It does not. It says something about a system you were never taught to train. And late at night, when you finally put the phone down, a small voice probably asks you why everyone else seems to have this figured out except you. They do not. They simply trained a system you have not started training yet, and that gap is closable. That single reframe changes everything that follows in this video, because if discipline is biological rather than moral, then judging yourself for lacking it is not just painful, it is scientifically inaccurate. But knowing the biology is only step 1. The next chapter reveals something far more uncomfortable, a hidden bias that actively fights to keep you exactly where you already are, even when staying there is quietly destroying the future you say you want. The hidden forces that keep you stuck. The next layer Walter introduces becomes one of the most psychologically revealing ideas in the entire book, and he calls it the status quo bias. This is the brain's deep preference for familiar circumstances over unfamiliar ones, even when the familiar circumstances are actively harming you. Walter argues that this bias operates beneath conscious awareness, which is precisely why so many intelligent, capable people remain trapped in jobs, relationships, and habits they privately know are wrong for them. Most summaries skip this entirely. We will not. Walter explains that loss aversion theory sits underneath this bias, meaning your brain weighs potential losses far more heavily than equivalent potential gains. So your mind quietly convinces you that staying still is safer than changing, even when staying still is the actual danger. This is where human nature becomes genuinely dangerous, because it disguises stagnation as stability and calls it wisdom. Alongside this, Walter introduces the Dunning-Kruger effect, the unsettling psychological pattern where people with limited competence in an area dramatically overestimate their own ability, while genuine experts remain painfully aware of everything they still do not know. The terrifying part is that most people never notice this pattern happening inside their own mind. Confidence without competence feels identical to confidence built on real mastery, until reality eventually forces the difference into view. Most people think confidence is the goal. In reality, the kind of confidence worth having is built only after you have honestly confronted how much you still do not know. That thought feels uncomfortable, almost insulting to the ego. But once you accept it, something powerful happens. You realize the discomfort of admitting your limits is actually the doorway into becoming dangerously competent, because awareness is always the first ingredient mastery requires. You are sitting here right now, and somewhere inside you already suspect which area of your life the status quo bias has quietly captured. Maybe it is your career. Maybe it is a relationship you call settled but privately call disappointing. The Vault perspective on this is different from most channels because we believe naming the trap honestly is the only way discipline ever becomes possible. The next section is where Walter finally hands you the antidote. Building the system discipline actually requires. We now arrive at the chapter that completely reshapes how most people think about willpower, the section where Walter shifts entirely toward daily habits and what he calls building the system discipline actually requires. His argument is simple but devastating to conventional advice. Goals alone create motivation that evaporates within days, while systems create identity that compounds quietly over months and years, regardless of how you feel on any single given morning. If you leave with nothing else from this video, leave with this. Walter insists that discipline is never built through occasional bursts of intense motivation. It is built through small, almost boring, repeated actions performed consistently even when motivation is completely absent. He recommends designing your environment deliberately, removing visible temptations, and stacking new disciplined behaviors directly onto habits you already perform automatically every single day without thinking. And what I'm about to tell you is the part of this book most people skim past without realizing its weight. Willpower, Walter explains, behaves like a depleable resource across a single day, weakening with every act of resistance you perform. This is why discipline collapses most often late in the evening, not because you suddenly became weak-willed, but because your reservoir of self-control has simply run dry from decisions made hours earlier without you noticing. Most people listening have blamed themselves for nighttime failures they had no real defense against. You were not weak. You were operating on an empty tank nobody warned you about. This is where mainstream advice collapses completely because it tells you to simply try harder at the exact moment your brain has the least capacity left to comply. Walter's system instead protects your discipline earlier in the day, when your reserves are highest. This single insight alone separates people who sustain transformation from people who burn out chasing it. Build the system when your willpower is full, not when it is empty, and discipline stops feeling like a daily war. But here's the uncomfortable truth that most people never see coming. The person who will sabotage your discipline the most is not a stranger, but someone who claims to love you. And what you do next determines whether you ever build the life you want. The enemies of discipline and how to defeat them. Before we move deeper into the architecture of self-mastery, there is a concept Walter believes deserves far more attention than he usually receives, and he names it energy vampires. These are the people surrounding you, whose negativity, doubt, or chronic complaining slowly drain the exact mental energy your discipline depends on to function. Walter argues that protecting your environment from these influences is not optional. It is a structural requirement for sustained self-control. And this next realization is the exact moment everything splits into before and after for most readers. Walter also tackles procrastination directly, dismantling the comforting excuse that waiting for the right moment is somehow strategic rather than avoidant. He references Parkinson's law, the principle that work expands to consume whatever time you allow it, meaning loose deadlines quietly invite delay, while tighter, more honest deadlines force genuine focused action almost immediately. Walter also shares a story from outside the book itself that illustrates this discomfort beautifully. Entrepreneur Jay Zhang, known for his TED Talk on rejection therapy, spent 100 days deliberately seeking rejection, asking strangers for absurd favors just to desensitize himself to fear. By the end, Zhang had transformed into someone confident and socially fearless, proving that discomfort, repeated deliberately, eventually stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like simple, familiar terrain. Most people think comfort is the reward for hard work. In reality, comfort is often the very thing quietly working against you. That thought feels heavy, almost like an attack on everything you have been taught to want. Though once you accept it, you realize avoiding discomfort has been the actual obstacle all along, which means the solution was never more motivation, only a willingness to stay slightly uncomfortable on purpose. The deeper layer most readers miss is that energy vampires and comfort addiction work together quietly, reinforcing each other until ambition itself starts to feel exhausting rather than exciting. This next idea is the reason this particular book has remained relevant on bestseller lists for years, because Walter is about to connect everything you have learned so far into something genuinely usable, something that determines whether transformation lasts or quietly fades within a few disappointing weeks. The inner game mindset, emotion, and sustainable mastery. We now enter the final chapter inside this breakdown, the one Walter dedicates to the emotional and philosophical core that makes discipline sustainable rather than exhausting. He draws on Zen philosophy and meditation to discuss focus, presence, and acceptance. He talks about rest, the long view, and the quiet inner work that holds everything else together. At this point, the blueprint feels complete, biology understood, biases named, systems built, enemies identified. But just when it seems the lesson is fully landed, Walter pivots into something far more demanding. He introduces what he calls falling in love with the process itself, arguing that anyone chasing outcomes alone will eventually quit the moment outcomes slow down. Inside the vault, we call this the hidden layer beneath motivation, because process devotion survives boredom, plateau, and failure in a way pure outcome obsession never can. Walter also explores how negative emotions, when examined honestly rather than suppressed, become fuel rather than obstacles. He discusses the Pareto principle alongside Sturgeon's law, reminding readers that roughly 80% of meaningful results come from 20% of focused effort. While most output anywhere, including your own past attempts, is mediocre by default, and only deliberate refinement separates forgettable work from work that actually matters. This is where mainstream advice collapses one final time because it tells you burnout is simply the cost of ambition. Walter disagrees sharply. He frames burnout as a system failure, not a badge of honor, insisting that sustainable discipline always includes deliberate rest, honest emotional processing, and boundaries protected as fiercely as any goal you are chasing. Most people listening right now are running on a deficit they have quietly normalized for years. And that small voice again, the one that whispers when the apartment goes quiet at night, asking whether you can really sustain this pace much longer. Walter's answer is unapologetic. You cannot, not without rebuilding rest into the architecture itself. This is where mastery and humanity finally meet, where discipline stops being punishment and becomes something closer to self-respect, practiced daily, defended fiercely, and never again confused with relentless, joyless self-punishment. Key lessons and insights. The invisible negotiation. The first lesson this book teaches us, and perhaps the most foundational one, is what Walter calls the invisible negotiation happening inside your prefrontal cortex every single time temptation appears. Recognizing this negotiation consciously, rather than letting it happen automatically, is the single fastest way to interrupt impulsive decisions before they occur. In business, this looks like pausing before an emotional reply. In personal life, it looks like noticing the urge before obeying it. Practically, this means building a small pause ritual, even 10 seconds before any decision involving temptation, money, or conflict. That pause activates the exact prefrontal region responsible for weighing long-term consequence. Over time, this tiny interruption becomes automatic, transforming impulsive reaction into deliberate, disciplined choice, which is ultimately the entire foundation Walter's biological argument was built to deliver from the very first page of this book. The status quo trap. The second lesson, and one that quietly explains years of stagnation for many readers, is recognizing the status quo bias actively operating inside your own decisions. Remember the question we opened with, about why your inability to change has nothing to do with talent. This is the answer. Your brain is not broken. It is simply defending familiar territory, even territory that is slowly costing you everything you claim to want. Practically, this means treating comfort as a signal worth questioning rather than trusting blindly. Before settling into any decision, ask honestly whether you are choosing it because it is right or simply because it is familiar. This single habit, applied consistently across career moves, relationships, and personal goals, dismantles years of quiet self-sabotage hiding behind the comforting disguise of stability, patience, or simply waiting for a better moment. Systems over motivation. The third lesson, arguably the most practically powerful inside the entire book, is building systems instead of chasing motivation. Motivation fluctuates daily and cannot be trusted as a foundation for anything meaningful. Systems, however, operate independently of mood, which is exactly why people who build them sustain transformation long after motivated beginners quietly disappear. Usually within the first few weeks of any new ambitious goal they once felt completely certain about achieving. Practically, this means designing your environment before relying on willpower at all. Remove visible temptations, automate disciplined behaviors by attaching them to existing routines, and protect your willpower earliest in the day when your reservoir is strongest. This single shift, environment before effort, is the deepest layer most readers miss entirely, and it is the structural difference between fleeting bursts of discipline and discipline that quietly lasts for years. Guard your energy. The fourth lesson involves protecting your environment from what Walter names energy vampires, the people whose chronic negativity quietly drains the exact resource your discipline depends on. This applies directly to leadership, business partnerships, and personal relationships because the people surrounding you either reinforce your standards or slowly erode them. Discipline is rarely lost in dramatic moments. It is lost gradually, inside ordinary conversations with people who never wanted you to grow. Practically, this means auditing your closest relationships honestly, asking which ones expand your ambition and which quietly shrink it. You do not need dramatic confrontation. You simply need intentional distance from chronic negativity and intentional closeness with people who model the discipline you are building. Energy, Walter insists, is finite and sacred, and protecting it is not selfish. It is the precondition for everything else in this book actually working. Fall in love with the process. The fifth and final lesson, the one that ties everything together, is learning to fall in love with the process itself rather than the distant outcome. Outcome obsession collapses the moment results slow down, which they always eventually do. Process devotion survives plateaus, failures, and boredom because it finds genuine meaning inside the daily repetition itself, regardless of how quickly or slowly the external results happen to be arriving. Practically, this means redefining what success feels like on a daily basis. Instead of measuring today by whether you reached the goal, measure it by whether you honored the process honestly. This reframe protects you from burnout, from energy vampires, from the status quo bias, and from the invisible negotiation itself, because process-devoted people rarely need a perfect mood to keep moving forward day after disciplined day. The vault closing, when you strip away every framework, every chapter, and every clever phrase, the power of discipline is ultimately not a book about productivity at all. It is a book about self-respect, quietly rebuilt one small, unglamorous decision at a time. Walter never promises a dramatic transformation overnight. He promises something far more honest, that discipline compounds invisibly, until one day, the version of you that once felt distant simply becomes who you already are. Here is your specific action for the next 7 days. Choose exactly one habit currently draining your discipline, whether that is a late-night scroll, a toxic conversation, or a delayed decision you have been avoiding, and interrupt it using the 10-second pause Walter describes. Do this every single day for 7 days, without exception, and notice how quickly your relationship with that single habit begins to shift beneath conscious effort. And that second thing we planted at the very start, the 10-minute experiment that quietly exposes how little self-control most people actually have here, is what it reveals. Try it yourself. Sit still for just 10 minutes, no phone, no stimulation. The urge to move, to check something, to escape the silence is the exact feeling of discipline being tested. That discomfort is not weakness. It is the muscle of self-control waking up, and the moment you stop running from it is the moment everything changes. If this video gave you even one unfair advantage tonight, like it, subscribe to the Book Vault, and comment your biggest takeaway below, because this community was built for people exactly like you.